Thanks for a wonderful
Joanna, go ahead.
panel. All of it was really interesting.
My name is...
On the last question, on the last talk, thank you, Reagan, for a good talk. I think this question comes from work that I've done with American vegetarians, not with international vegetarians, but Americans, where there's an enormous number of lifestyle factors other than diet that come into play with people who are very committed, and it becomes more and more great as people become more and more restricted in their food intake. And my question is, how good the data-driven approaches are, or the stratification, or all the other techniques in epidemiology, at getting at these other exposures that are associated with diet, but they're also associated with the outcome, the chronic disease outcome, and I've never been able to.
That's an excellent point, and that's why for the vegetarian section, I really wanted to focus on the Seventh-day Adventists, because they're doing a vegetarian diet for religious reasons. They're not doing it because they're extreme athletes or for any other reason. So it's almost a more balanced type of examination, but it is truly something that in any study we have to contend with. You know, people that use more supplements exercise more. They think their health is better. So there are a collinearity of health behaviors that travel together, and diet is just one of those many things. And so we have to be cognizant of that, and that realize that sometimes diet might be a marker for all of those other things, and the clustering of all of those things is really important. Actually, the pattern of the patterns is what we need to be looking at, is my point.
Yeah, absolutely right, Johanna, that there's so many lifestyle, socioeconomic, demographic, so many factors that impact on the outcome that we are looking at besides the diet. And in fact, when I was preparing this presentation, I realized the amount of limitations that the authors were reporting that were not necessarily manifested in the conclusions. But, you know, between diet and dietary patterns, if I had to talk about diets, it would have been enormous. Whereas with this mathematical approach in generating dietary patterns, at least one could say, using a common pathway, method of analysis, this is what they got. And certainly they took into consideration the various factors that they had. So yeah, we need to take all these results with a big pinch of salt.
I just want to comment something to Reagan. When we are studying Adventists, we have a problem because some of them are optional lacto-egg vegetarians, because some of them, they study in Adventist schools and they have their proper meal during the 5 days, and they are going home during the weekends and they eat meat. This is very, very common among them because it's not a religious thing. They are optional meat and egg and lacto-vegetarian. So it's sometimes very tricky to separate them who are protected, who are not.
Okay, I would like to congratulate all the presentations were excellent. I was wondering, when we are talking about food or in terms of risk, we talk about in or out. And for instance, dairies or meat have different contents of fats, and it can vary from 4% in a chicken breast or 25% in an Argentine meat in sometimes. So do you know any kind of study that studied the risk in terms not vegetarian or not, but including the content of fat of the dairies and meats?
Well, the Western pattern is red and processed meat, so those are going to have higher fat than the prudent pattern, which is typically, poultry and fish, and low-fat dairy, whereas the Western is high-fat dairy. So again, it's not directly getting at your question, but at least those are the way the patterns are classified. But how those are interacting with the other foods in that pattern is another question.
I have a question for all the speakers, because this was mainly the same exercise, but in different regions, maybe a different perspective from you, Claude. But I would like to hear from you, when you were listening to the other presentation, what was very affirming to you, and conversely, what was very surprising in listening to the presentations from other regions?
I didn't listen to the other presentation.
Reagan was doing her slides.
I think vegetables is something that came across in in most areas. I don't know.
Well, I think that one common feature of all the contributions was to illustrate the diversity. In any place on earth, people manage to have different ways of doing their nutrition duties, and people are extremely creative in this aspect of their lives, probably in other aspects as well. So I was struck by the fact that certainly there's one uniform aspect of nutrition. You have to meet your requirements for energy and nutrients, but then other than that, people are extremely creative and do it in a large number of ways. They make a lot of they can exploit their environment, their local resources to an amazing degree, and it's very, very impressive to hear all those different contributions that illustrate the creativity of humankind. There's something in particular that struck me as intriguing, and it's something that Reagan said a couple of times. It's about the existence of people who have a pattern of alcohol and salad intake. So, frankly, in Europe, I don't think I've ever seen or heard of anything that approaches that notion. So, could you please tell us what would those people do? They get up in the morning, have some lettuce and some alcohol, and go on until the nighttime. How does it go?
That's one of the limitations of the names of these patterns, is that those were the foods that had the highest factor loadings, but clearly that's not the only thing that these people are eating. But the combination of salads, but with low-fat dressing, not with full-fat dressing, in a couple of papers that I looked at, and then really a lot of wine.
Is that a population where the highest contribution to the daily energy intake is from alcohol?
I don't think I would say that. I would have to look, but definitely there, 2-3 glasses of wine a night.
You think that's
Which
a lot?
some people think is excessive. I mean, no, I'm not putting any labels on anything here. I mean, I wanted to have the panel discussion at a bar, so no judgment from me. I'm just reporting.
Well, that's intriguing. That's a very surprising, aspect of human nutrition. And I must say that I'm very intrigued by those individuals. I would like to learn more about them. Now, Mauro, will you?
One of the interesting things that we have learned from this session is one word that we can call adaptation. We have westernized the Asian food, and at the same time, we, in Western areas, we are Asian our food. So we are incorporating some foods that are not traditional very, very fast, like raw food, raw fish. That's something very new to our civilization, to our ways. And we are incorporating it very fast, especially in young people. They are having, it was very expensive, now it's not so much expensive, it is still expensive, but they are incorporating it very fast. And probably in a few years, we'll have a modification of these patterns, because especially the middle classes and the high classes, they are modifying their way of behaving. They have one discourse, but they behave differently. They do think that meat probably is not very well for your health, it's not very good, but they have their barbecues very, very frequently. So I think we have some kind of speech and some kind of behavior. So it's not very easy sometimes to establish which is the real pattern of individuals. I think when we are working together, we have some tendencies to modify the information a little bit.
I just want to go back to Fran's point about the importance of socioeconomic status in relations to food intake, especially in these challenging times of rising food prices all over the world. And because they don't have as much choices as those in the higher income status, so they are reduced to taking the more saturated vegetable oils, the lacking fruits and vegetables, which tend to be more expensive. And so we must be very mindful of this factor. And one more is in relation to Claude's presentation. I think we need to also complement quantitative studies with the qualitative approaches, like the use of focus group, get into observations in addition to just asking people questions based on a questionnaire.
Claude? Anything surprising, affirming?
Well, I think what's surprising, maybe not, but striking is the differences in approaches between researchers themselves. For instance, in the Asian studies, I was really impressed with the degree of refinement in the culinary hypotheses tested, that is, differences in effects on health of various recipes of rice. That's, of course, it would probably be extremely difficult to establish causation on the basis of correlations such, but it's what I see in it is a different perspective on research, on nutrition, on the assumptions, etc. So, for instance, if you go to Japan, there's always the issue of Japanese rice versus American rice, and when you talk to the Japanese, the differences in their minds are enormous. So the implications in health, I've seen some colleagues who were trying to assess potential differences health-wise. So that's one thing. We're all culturally different, and we're interested in we have different points of view, different approaches. When Reagan announced that patterns include everything, place, people, where, how, I was really interested. But then I was disappointed because you never mentioned it again with your data.
Well, because people weren't looking at it. It's not my data, but people weren't looking
that's
at
what
it
I
that
mean.
way. But I think
It's high
where we
time to
have
look at the
to look
information
at it.
because it's there.
And
Adam gave an example yesterday of showing what you can find in the NHANES data, in the census data.
Yeah.
So yes, I agree, qualitative, quantitative. I mean, you have to adjust the tool to the object of the research. You're not going to watch stars with a microscope and bacteria with a telescope. And in the same way, we have to use all the tools that we have. And in some ways, qualitative plus quantitative can provide, for instance, we use qualitative to generate a hypothesis that we try to put figures on afterwards, or we use qualitative to clarify some results from the quantitative data that we can have. That sort of approach.
Hello, I enjoyed everyone's presentation. I have two questions for two separate presentations. One is to Dr. Bailey. Do you think that well, most people consider vegetarian versus vegan to be the more healthier choice, but you had one slide that showed that the colorectal cancer risk for vegans was not significant in vegans, but in vegetarians it was. So I wanted to ask if you thought there was any mechanistic explanation behind that.
Yeah, I mean, what I thought was most striking from that slide was the fish. And that was something that came across with Scandinavian countries, with Asian countries, is that there seems to be a protective effect of fish regardless. I don't know what would be the difference between vegetarian and vegan because, I mean, other than, you know, the obvious, the differences in milk and eggs, but I don't know what mechanism by which milk and eggs would cause a differential colorectal cancer response.
And my second question was to Dr. Claude. You had like social behavioral aspects in eating, and I wanted to know, I don't remember your stats on the French population and obesity, but in my head it was like lower. If I'm wrong, please correct me. But do you think that there's any social shaming that goes on with eating in groups that maybe if you eat by yourself, that doesn't present itself as a problem? To where you might binge eat like we learned yesterday or something?
Well, both France and I were interested in that issue, and frankly, it's difficult to figure it out right now with what we have. But I think it's an exciting area for research and for analysis of existing data that haven't been looked at sufficiently. Obviously, eating in groups has effects. As I said, there's something called social facilitation that you can already observe in animals, and you take 2 chicken and 2 hens, and one has been fed with grain and is satiated. Another hen is put into the picture and starts pecking, and what happens is that the previous hen that is satiated comes back and starts eating again. So there's a competitive dimension, there's a self-regulatory dimension, there are inhibitory potentials, there are stimulating potentials. It's an extraordinarily complex area, and I don't see how we can understand human eating behavior without looking into it in depth.
I'd just like to add that eating habits, dietary patterns, these are dynamic processes that change even within a generation. So traditionally, families in Asia may eat together, but as they become more developed and behave more like Western societies, then this habit diminishes. And in fact, in Korea, as in my readings, the very traditional dietary pattern was quite high in sodium, and in Japan too. But over the years, the salt intake in Japan and Korea have come down and reflected in the prevalence of hypertension, which is very good. But it is still relatively higher than in other Asian countries. Same thing with taking of sugar. It's quite high in Thailand and Malaysia. And so we're trying to address this problem. But these are changes, and one thing good is I see for myself as people become more health conscious, then they try to go into the so-called prudent diet from the traditional diet and moving away from the Western diet if they have choices.
Florence, do you want to address the question of the alone versus with others?
Yes, it's clearly a very important aspect of the eating, the environment of the meal, the context of the meal. I agree with Claude that this is a very, very critical aspect of our eating experience, and it does determine how much we will eat and how much of what we will eat. I am an experimental psychologist, and I work with tools of experimental psychology. So I like to do little experiments in laboratory conditions, and I know for certain that if you invite people to have lunch under laboratory conditions, you can serve the same foods at the same time of day to the same people, but the amount they will eat and the enjoyment they will derive from eating that same amount of food will be considerably different depending on the number of people that are around, whether those people are friends or colleagues or strangers. So this is clearly a very important dimension. Other dimensions of the surroundings of the consumer at the time of the meal are highly important, and we've not talked about that at all during the last hour and a half. And this has to do with distracting stimuli in the environment. If you eat in front of a TV, if you're watching TV or playing on your computer games at the time of the meal, then there might be people around you sharing the meal, but you're indifferent to them, and you're alone in your little planet doing something different. So this also influences how much you will eat, how much you will appreciate your meal. One of the conditions we tested in our laboratory in Paris was a lunchtime meal in healthy, lean women, you know, true Parisian women, lean, you know, fashionable and so on. And they are very much under the influence of the external circumstances. If you make them eat in the company of others, similar ladies together, they will not eat more, but they will enjoy the meal more if they are in company. So you ask them about how pleasant the experience was after the meal. They will tell you that it was a great deal more pleasant if they could eat in company as opposed to eating the same foods and the same number of calories alone. And again, another factor that we did not deal with today was the importance of individual differences of many, many kinds. And one crucial factor is everybody's own attitude to body weight control. A lot of people, especially in developed societies where we have too much to eat generally, and probably this takes place in the various continents that we talked about today. If a person is under restrictive, inhibitory, self-imposed limitation of food intake, then this will also make a great deal of difference. Whether or not this person eats a Western type of diet or alcohol and salad diet or whatever. So this is a crucial dimension. There are so many things that we've not talked about, and unfortunately, probably something that would have to be addressed in a session like this is the importance of enjoyment. We've talked about risk. We've talked about disease. We've talked about, you know, if you do this, that will make you ill earlier, that will reduce your life expectancy. But I think equally important and probably much more important is the enjoyment experience of having food in company, having the foods that you like, that you've learned to like as a child or as an adult. And this is also a very critical dimension that unfortunately researchers in nutrition, I think, do not pay enough attention to, because we are so focused on prevention of disease and helping people to be healthy. Helping people to be happy with food would be something that we should think is part of our work.
I just want to a little point about your Parisian women enjoying being together. That was a slide I skipped. I have the data, not about Parisians particularly, but about 2,400 women in 3 cities, Colombia, Rennes in the west of France, and Odense in Denmark. And this is part of a project we did with Daniel Kahneman and his team on well-being and happiness, experienced well-being and happiness. And I just looked at the data about eating. eating occasions, and it turns out that in all three countries, very clearly, eating occasions taken in company are rated much higher than lonely eating occasions. It was highly predictable, but the fact is the data is here.
I just want to react to what you both just said about happiness, and enjoyment, and a little bit of a healthy relationship with food. In general, we've done some ethnographies about how, in the US, about how people approach weight loss and maintaining their weight, etc. And we've done 3 over the last decade. And we've seen really, really a very strong shift, which is, for me, it's good news for the future. Very strong shift on how the approach to food and weight loss. And we've heard a lot of consumers and moms saying, I am tired, I am sick of having this very, very difficult relationship with the food. I've been in war with my food for my whole life. I don't want my kid to see that model in me. I don't want to cook 3 times for different diets within the household. So I think there's a shift towards a healthier relationship with food that consumers are looking forward to. Is that a path to happiness? We'll see, but it's a good first step. I do have a question for you, Claude. You described a little bit the commercialism and individualism, and my question is about the US. We are also seeing a lot of these diets, like gluten-free diets, vegan, and one of the characteristics of those diets is that they, most of the time, really define some communities, and you have communities of vegan communities, and they exchange recipes, they see each other often. Is that a different form of commercialism, or not at all, by your definition?
I think it probably is, you're right, but it doesn't work for all regiments the same way. For instance, in France, there's an association of people with celiac disease who have been, like in many countries, and they've been active to obtain rules for labeling and that sort of thing. And I was talking to the current head of the association and asking how she was feeling about the sudden increase in the number of members for her association, and the sort of paradoxical situation in which she has a lot more, the association gets a lot more money and income and exposure, but at the same time is a little embarrassed with people who haven't really been diagnosed with anything. And the community is disturbed more than anything by this current increase of active participants. So what we find in all the studies we've compiled or carried out is that basically adopting one of those free something, gluten-free, lactose-free, etc., when you talk to people, sounds like a way of reappropriating one's food. There's a sense of loss of control. People talk all the time about constant changes, fads, and they themselves, even when they themselves adopt a fad, they feel uncomfortable, increasingly anxious about the supposed outcome of their eating habits. And once they found something relatively easy with a theory behind it to support it, like, I don't know, the Neolithic, Paleolithic to Neolithic transition theory for the gluten-free or that sort of thing, well, they stick to it for a certain time. It's not clear yet whether it's going to last, but I don't see. Oh yes, and in the case of Europe, it's the emergence of these adoptions of regimens seems to be associated with higher, stricter regulation at the European level on health claims. It costs too much to make health claims now. It's easier to come up with things about gluten or lactose.
Good afternoon. Jeff Smith for ILSI Southeast Asia region. Fascinating presentations and a very interesting topic. I wonder if the panel could address 2 or 3 things that they think might give the most positive impact to lending credence to the various hypotheses that are proposed. We've seen in the studies that have been discussed a lot of uncertainties talked about, and that's well known. But we find some inconsistent patterns. We're trying to look at historical data, but I think it's a fair statement that most Mediterraneans don't eat a Mediterranean diet these days. Most Okinawans don't eat an Okinawan diet. As far as I've met Japanese who are surprised to learn that it's not a Japanese company. I think there's more per capita McDonald's in Japan than in America. At the same time, we saw a presentation this morning from ILSI South Africa showing obesity rates among girls, I think 15 to 25, if I remember well, approaching 60%, 70% in almost every province in South Africa. There's no study yet of dietary intakes. When I go to South Africa, I'm not sure I could characterize their diet. It doesn't seem like so different than a lot of other diets around the world. And even we look at scientific studies, so there's a new study coming out from Corey, Ronald Krauss in this group, taking a DASH diet plus saturated fat, and they found, again, lowering of hypertension and, in fact, a decrease in triglycerides. The other day, we heard a whole session on uncertainties in dietary intakes, so I think it's pretty conclusive that the energy intakes are not very accurate when we do it by the usual methods of 24-hour recall or food frequency questionnaire. So all these conflicting factors, and then one other presentation we had a keynote speech on the importance of physical activity. So people who are exercising, even if obese, seem to have better, at least cardiovascular outcomes. So all of those things taken together, and with the recent sobering experience of cholesterol, with 40 years of advice to reduce cholesterol intakes, and now, well, okay, never mind. What's a body to do? So, all those distinguished scientists, it'd be interesting to have some commentary on what we understand. This is a really, really difficult problem. You cannot monitor individuals for their 40 years, 50, 60, 70 years, see what they've eaten every day and in what quantities. What could be done to have better scientific studies that are better to have, that are better, more likely to lead to better predicted outcomes?
I think if we had the answer to that question, we wouldn't be in this room. You know, I mean, I don't know.
Well, where fools dare not tread, or the angels do not tread, the fools rush in, and I'm like a fool rushing in to answer that. Maybe it's in the air that we breathe. But seriously, air pollution has been, increasingly the literature showing air pollution as a determinant of diabetes in Asia. And there's emerging data on air pollution with obesity. So, but we need to look at big data for this kind of association. But the equation, like Jeff, you said, is diet intake, energy intake, and energy expenditure. I seriously think it's an increased sedentariness that is driving the increase in obesity globally. Look at our lifestyles from children to adults, you know, all the time sitting down.
Thank you for this question, which is really absolutely fundamental. And you gave the example of cholesterol. If only it was just cholesterol. We've been fed trans fats for years. And now we read on Time magazine's cover story, eat butter. We've been advised by allergists, what do you call them in English, allergologists? People in the allergy business, that you should not diversify children's diet before the age of, and then the reversal of that recommendation after a few years because the incidence of allergies was increasing. We have innumerable examples. We have a wonderful example in a recent PBS program with Michael Pollan, a documentary. There is an archive piece of the McGovern Committee back in 1977 or 78 in which one of the experts advises strongly to continue research before doing anything or recommending anything. And McGovern says, as a US senator, doesn't have the latitude research scientists have to keep researching in their lab. They have to do something. So in the name of action, rather than too much reflection, we have to admit at long last that too many mistakes have been made. I'm not saying people died or were ill, or they probably were in large numbers, but enormous sums of money have been wasted. Before doing anything, it should be realized that I think scientific knowledge at all times, I mean, even the most solid scientific ideas or theories, at all times remain, I would say, biodegradable. And it's difficult to implement anything with enough safety. And it's probably one of the greatest risks we are facing. Just realizing that would be a huge progress, I think.
We need a positive note to finish this panel.
I think that's positive.
Okay.
Think twice.
Well, more reflection and the research will go on. So thank you very much to the speakers again, and thank you for sticking with us until 5:31.